Globalization is fantastic for the consumer. The pants that you have on may cost $80. To ship it across the sea costs 50 cents. We get everything at fantastic quality, low prices, but we have a mismatch between people who are white-collar workers. We're on one side of the digital divide, and then we have another part of the country that's on the other side, who've created these supply chains that are everywhere in the world. And what we learned with COVID is they're actually too complex.
Overseas, those COVID lockdowns in China are again threatening the global supply chain.
81 massive ships currently in line waiting to unload.
The pandemic highlighted seismic complexities into how global manufacturing and distribution of goods operate for industries worldwide. Everything from manufacturing disruptions to the surge in demand for certain products. My guest today is Jack Buffington, an author and professor on supply chains. And he argues that by combining new tools like 3D printing and blockchain with local manufacturing, we can unlock supply chains' true potential.
The investment needs to be in innovation to create these new technologies, to win in these spaces, but in a digital world, not in an industrial world. That, to me, seems like to be what the magic of supply chain could be in the 21st century.
Coming up later, we'll visit a company innovating the yard distribution industry through automation and AI. Stick around as we dive into the problems facing our supply chain, the unintended challenges it has created for American workers, and how technology may provide innovative solutions for both. The only way to solve our biggest problems is to have the audacity to try. Welcome to In the Arena with Evan Baer.
Jack, it's great to be with you in conversation today, and I've got to dive in. You have been a practitioner in business, an advisor to business, and now running an academic center and an author on a topic of supply chain. I imagine some people, when you say supply chain, they don't know what it is, they think they don't care, they think it doesn't matter for them. To a layperson, what is supply chain?
So supply chain is the balancing of supply and demand. Before World War II, actually at the end of the 19th century, the Americans and the West discovered fossil fuels and the energy density power of using machines to create goods. The World War II ended, most of the West was decimated through the war, but the United States was still the industrial power of the world. 50% of manufacturing was happening in the United States. The problem we had in the United States is there was concern from economists of now we're going to enter in the next depression. We needed to move from wartime economy to a peacetime economy. So what happened is these supply chains created the first consumer economy where consumers had all this power. So the move went from production to consumption.
So fast forward all the way through to a modern product like the iPhone.
Yeah.
What magic happens through the supply chain to create an iPhone?
What's amazing about the iPhone is the invention of the iPhone is the technology. The real magic from the supply chain comes is how to source everything to create this final assembly where there's more than 40 countries that are involved to make this smartphone that sits in your pocket. And there's someone who works for Apple, who works for Samsung, who has to coordinate all these activities to get these raw materials to turn into components to be able to be finally assembled in China or Taiwan in a way that's cost effective and effective for markets. And that's just one product. And you can go through a whole bunch of other products. There's a lot of people outside your retailer that are involved in this, and most consumers don't even understand it.
I want to learn a little bit about how sophisticated our supply chain is. I remember when I think the longshoremen protest in Los Angeles had those photos showing all of the container ships off the port. The containers look rusty. They're on this giant old ship that looks like it's 50 years old. It doesn't look particularly sophisticated what's going on. So walk through some of the parts of our supply chain that to you feel really cutting edge, and what parts actually still in need of a lot of innovation.
So what's interesting about the LA port that you mentioned is that the visual of that is you see all these ships that are out in the ocean and you think it's a breakdown of the port. But really what it is, it's all the elements of the supply chain when it comes to how you design a supply chain. So when you make a smartphone, you can't just start making it. Someone has to design all these country relationships that need to happen. So that's the first step is you don't just design a product, you also design a supply chain. Now you have to have people who source where these materials are going to come from, right? So you mentioned we're going to get this raw material from Tanzania, we're going to get this material from Bolivia, and then we're going to manufacture it in Germany, and we're going to manufacture the speaker in Japan. It's not just the planning of how things are sourced, but it's also the execution of it, making sure it all happens. And then you have all the transportation and logistics, because you have to decide if you're going to ship the product directly to a consumer or you're going to ship it first to a warehouse. And if you're shipping overseas, you have to go through customs. I mean, there's all these things that are happening that have to happen with impeccable velocity and efficiency. That is the magic of our world.
Tell me a little bit more about the planning process. So for example, as a practical thing, for me, if we're having a birthday party for my child and we're going to say, plan sourcing some raw materials to have an art project on our kitchen table at a birthday party. We go to Amazon maybe the day before, we pick out some paints and some brushes and some mats and some artifacts, etc. In 24 hours, we have all the things we need on our kitchen table for the child's party. I'm assuming it's not quite like that. Are there digital platforms? How sophisticated and modern is this B2B sourcing complexity that you're talking about?
This is where companies are winning and losing in the 21st century. It's all about data and information. I mean, you think about all the data that's available today for a company like Walmart or a company like Target, a company like Coors, to be able to plan their supply chains. The companies who are the best at this are the ones who are winning. Because they understand that no plan is ever perfect. You can never predict a pandemic or a war or anything like that. But the companies with the best data win. And so they have these enormous data systems where they're gathering data from retail, they're gathering data from their suppliers, they're collaborating. And this is how companies prevent product outages or increased costs, is by trying to coordinate all these agents that we've talked about in an efficient manner.
You've mentioned COVID-19, which I have to imagine for you as an academic is sort of this terrible but wonderful event to see what happens to supply chains. In the middle of COVID-19, tell us a little bit about what were you watching? What facts or stats or situations did you find the most interesting during the pandemic?
Well, one thing is I left industry right before COVID. So all my friends that were in supply chain were like, well, you left at the right time. What I was looking for is how companies were looking for signals. For example, toilet paper. There could be a 6-month lead time of chopping down a tree, pulping it, turning it into roll. And so with a long-term forecast need and a short-term problem running out of stock, you have to fill in the gaps. And so I was interested to watch how companies were understanding what data they have and what data they don't have and how to fill in those gaps. Companies have gotten really good at learning from COVID-19 on how to use tools like AI to fill in the gap, to best use the data that they have, because one problem with data is it's the past. So how do you use data to understand the future? And companies have used events like COVID and wars to improve their systems. Now, the problem is some companies aren't. And so it's really, what I'm watching is that how companies are responding to what's happening to improve their supply chains.
One of the calls around COVID-19 that at least US politicians have been making is about the importance of what we'd call repatriating manufacturing. Talk a little bit about what does repatriation of manufacturing mean, and are you excited about the prospect of that?
Yeah, I think part of the discussion is off base. They talk about repatriating things from a financial standpoint that will never make sense. You mentioned fast fashion. I mean, just the economics of that doesn't make sense. Pharmaceuticals is another example. I think that's an amazing opportunity to repatriate. Because right now, what a lot of Americans don't understand is a lot of generic drugs and the active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs are made in countries like China and India. And what happened during COVID is a lot of these supply chains were cut off. Antibiotics, some very important medications and APIs weren't available. What I think is really exciting about repatriation is we have to reimagine what that means. And so we have to use emerging technologies to make this happen. So like 3D printing is an amazing opportunity for pharmaceuticals because a lot of pharmaceuticals are powder. So it's really easy to repatriate, but the problem is regulation would prevent that because a 3D printed drug would be considered to be new, and so the FDA would have to approve it. And so that's the problem, is that I think if we change regulation to enable technologies, we can repatriate really important things like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, and I think that's the way to go.
I want to uncover and explore how we got here. There is a great essay called I, Pencil that Milton Friedman talks about, and you may use in your courses with your students. But it is Friedman marveling about the complexity of a pencil, that the rubber is from Guyana and the wood is from Washington, and he doesn't even know where the paint is from. And so thousands of people were part of making something as simple as a pencil. And what that means for the consumer is probably a better quality pencil, more quickly available at a lower price. And then he also makes a comment that, and those thousands of people involved in making that one pencil probably have never met each other, and if they did, may not like each other. So there's a human component to all of the trade and manufacturing that's happening. But as I listen to the story from Friedman, and I think about the situation that a $12 sweater from Zara came from 15 different countries, part of me says, this is an amazing accomplishment that we can pull this off. But during COVID, and maybe a little bit in your comments too, there's some piece of how it evolved that makes you worried, that it kind of went awry along the way. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think you are right about that. And I understood supply chains before I became a supply chain professional because I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which was an old industrial town that over the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, basically became a hollow shell of itself. All the shipyards left, GM left, Bethlehem Steel, the largest steel maker, left town, and nothing became of the city. And so globalization is fantastic when it comes to that example of the pencil for the consumer. We get everything at fantastic quality, low prices and everything like that, but we have a mismatch between people who are successful, people who are white-collar workers, like us. We're on one side of the digital divide, and then we have another part of the country that's on the other side. And so when we talk about repatriation, we could bring back supply chains in a way where we can repatriate in some of these areas that were left behind when I was growing up. That to me seems like to be what the magic of supply chain could be in the 21st century.
I want to talk about this low wage earner in the United States and exactly what globalization has meant for them. Clearly, there's some set that their previous blue-collar work has been moved overseas. And I do want to point out that when we say it has sort of shut down or it's moved, there was a business operator, an owner, who ran the numbers and said, we can create more profit and deliver more value to our shareholders and our customers by moving these things offshore. So for some US workers, it meant they lost their work. It's also the case that if they're shopping at a Walmart or wherever they're shopping, they are getting low-cost, higher quality goods as a result of globalization. So say more about what globalization has meant in these last 50 years for the blue-collar workers of America.
This is optimization, from a business standpoint, is to move the production of something in the place where it makes the most sense. So I think businesses are doing what they're supposed to do. The question is, how do you bring people back into the economy who used to work in old-style manufacturing? And my point of view on this is bring manufacturing back and retrain the people who used to do manufacturing differently. So I think this is exciting, of trying to find a rebalancing of supply and demand through supply chains, but in a digital world, not in an industrial world. So I think the investment needs to be in innovation to create these new technologies, to win in these spaces, and then the manufacturing will be there.
So for the shipyard worker who has 10 years left in his career, the shipyard shuts down.
Yeah.
What do we think they'll do for the next 20 years?
One thing that's going to happen is all the shipyards are going to be completely automated. It's already starting to happen in the world. You're starting to see blue-collar workers in fields, unions pushing back on what they see as inevitable. And that's the big question is, there's this contention in the current state as opposed to reimagining what these people will do in the future state. And I think the problem is, if these people aren't retooled, they're going to be on the outside looking in. And so I think the focus needs to be on how to bring people into the digital economy. I think the big companies and the big supply chains will always exist. What my model is as an alternative is a smaller individual community-based supply chain that won't replace the big supply chain, but will be an alternative to it where more people can become entrepreneurs, but they have to be understanding technology like you do in order to be successful in that world.
Community-based supply chain. I'm nervous about where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Make your case. What do you mean by this local-based alternative to supply chains?
Yeah, so I look at new emerging technologies as potentially a utility that could be fostered through a community. It's just like water, just like electricity. So if you put in blockchain, 3D printing, these sorts of technologies as a public utility, and then you let individuals become entrepreneurs. That's what I mean by this.
Tell me a little about blockchain. Remind us, what is blockchain and how is it used in supply chain?
Blockchain has a bad connotation right now because it's associated with cryptocurrency. But blockchain is bigger than this because basically all money is a transaction. So you grow corn, I grow wheat, your corn's ready before my wheat, so I give you a piece of paper which says when the wheat's ready, I'll give you the wheat as a trade. And so what blockchain was the potential to do is to create this fluid transactional system beyond big companies, because big companies like Walmart and Procter & Gamble are super efficient, and that's the reason why Walmart wants to do business with Procter & Gamble, not necessarily because they make the best diapers or toothpaste, because they're transactionally fluid. Where blockchain would become transformational in supply chain is if there became standards, so anybody can enter the supply chain and you can reduce the economies of scale for transaction efficiency that the big companies have.
Give us a sense of how big of a problem is breaking contracts or violating contracts or documents not getting done correctly. Is that more than 1% of transactions?
It's huge. And that's the reason why I mentioned, like if you made cereal and you went to Walmart headquarters, they'd be just like, I don't care how good your cereal is. We just don't feel like we could be transactionally efficient with you as we could with Kellogg's.
So the point is not really rooting out sort of fraud and transaction. It's actually helping a smaller new entrant be able to act like an incumbent player through a sophisticated transactional capability.
Yeah, correct on that side. I will tell you, when it comes to global transactions, there is the fraud and the problems with authenticating, which blockchain can help out with. And when these ships come into port, it's impossible to authenticate everything that's on that container. And so if you could use some improved tool like blockchain, you could have safer cargo that's going around the planet, number one. And then on this other side, if you could enable individual entrepreneurs to have efficiency, transactional efficiency, they could compete when it comes to the larger supply chain.
So sort of like maybe something like when Amazon Web Services came along and meant that as a startup, you didn't need a rack of many thousands of dollars and complexity to manage it from an IT perspective. You think there could be things that we design that actually let more people more easily enter the global supply chain?
Yeah, that's correct. Because today, me as a corporate manager, we win through consolidation. We win through economies of scale. And that's what gives us all the great goods that we have. Fantastic as a consumer, fantastic for shareholders. But it's not necessarily always great for workers. It's not always great for communities. And I think we address this problem by enabling smaller entrepreneurs.
Let's take a break from our conversation to go to Brighton, Colorado, to visit Outrider, a company using autonomous technologies to transform the supply chain through logistics yard operations. At this facility, Outrider tests their system prior to deploying it in distribution yards across the country.
Autonomous yard operations are critical to the supply chain because the distribution yard is this linkage where you have trailers coming in from over-the-road transportation operations, getting dropped off, and then moved around these yards to different dock doors. And when you have inefficiency within these distribution centers, you create inefficiency within the whole supply chain.
This is what the traffic bottleneck looks like at the ports of LA and Long Beach. There are dozens of cargo ships just sitting in the water waiting to be unloaded.
Cargo ship disruptions, like we saw in Long Beach, lead to delayed product delivery, heightened demand, and an inevitable surge in prices.
About 10 billion tons of freight move around North America alone on an annual basis, and the majority of that moves through a distribution yard. If a trucker cannot drop off a trailer and then find the new trailer that they want to pick up, that means you have millions of truck drivers wasting tens of millions of days a year sitting around distribution centers either waiting in traffic or looking for trailers. We were started back in 2017 specifically to address this task. And from what we know, we're the only company that has been developed specifically to address supply chain automation in the distribution yard.
The engineers at Outrider have developed a way to automate some of the most tedious and time-consuming tasks in distribution yards.
Tychus. When we have the no-touch testing operations,
On their web-based platform, technicians inside an Outrider facility can dispatch a fully autonomous 20,000-pound electric vehicle to find a desired trailer, hitch the vehicle to the trailer, and then drive the trailer back through the distribution yard to a loading dock so that the trailer can be emptied or filled with goods. This process requires a robotic arm to safely connect and disconnect the brake lines of a trailer in order to allow the trailer to move.
in order to do this, you literally have to develop a very specialized team and a very specialized set of technology to address all the manual tasks that have taken place in yards over the last 50 years.
The biggest challenge is being able to handle this ever-growing population of trailers. So we don't control what trailers we have to move. They just come in, and there's millions which flow through the country. So if you try to move a trailer, if you hitch to it and grab it, it won't move because for safety reasons, the brakes are on. So you have to connect an air hose that puts positive air pressure and releases the brakes. And all these glad hands are different. There's like 5 brake categories and then subcategories, and they come in different conditions. Some might be broken. And the challenge here is that you have to make very advanced deep learning to perceive the environment. So the truck has sensors like lidars, cameras, and radars to decide what the environment looks like, identifying what type of connection it is, and have a specific strategy and decide what to do next to successfully move a trailer from point A to point B.
Outrider realized you couldn't really automate a yard without automating this very complex robotic task. But by using deep learning and a robotic manipulator, we're actually able to train the system to see this variety of brake line connections and connect to over 98% of the different ones on the road today. We've now done tens of thousands of autonomous move missions and has collected literally millions and millions of data sets in these yard environments, allowing us to train our vehicles and robotic systems to work with an ever-increasing number of trailers and an ever-increasing variety of yards.
Outrider's technology is trained on millions of data points from Fortune 500 customer distribution yards, and it plans to launch its commercial system in the second half of 2024. But increasing truck movement efficiency isn't the company's only goal. Outrider also focuses on improving the safety practices and environmental impacts in the yard distribution industry as well.
Electric yard trucks are the perfect application for electric vehicles because this is a confined environment. There's no range anxiety. We can charge these systems during low periods in the manufacturing or distribution operation. It's a more stable platform for autonomy, and it's a safer environment for those working around it. Rather than having people out there connecting airlines of trailers or maneuvering in these tight environments, you have robots doing this work where you have people overseeing the system. So by putting these tools at the fingertips of the people that operate these yards, it's really enhancing the potential of human capital, essentially create a more pleasant, more tech-forward job for the warehouse operator of the future. We are scaling our commercial systems in 2024, so the goal will be to have thousands of these systems operating on Outrider software. We are really excited about how Outrider's technology has the ability to change the industry and inspire others.
It's interesting to think about what innovation in yard distribution can mean for the supply chain. But let's return now to our discussion with Jack.
I want to ask you about 2 sort of silly situations that blow my mind. The first situation I want to ask you about is for about $6, I can order a box of sugar packets and have them delivered the next day for free from Amazon. Make sense of what's happening with Amazon and e-commerce last mile delivery.
So what these behemoths in retail are doing are just basically, winning through information and logistics. Now, the reason why Amazon can do that is are you an Amazon Prime member?
Of course.
Of course you are, right. And so they use predictive analytics to figure out what you're gonna buy. And so this is brilliant. What they do is they use data analytics to predict you and also to goad you into buying that sugar So that way they keep their inventory levels down and they can do that impossible logistics move in order to beat everybody else.
So counsel me on this. I love Amazon so much. I love when they suggest a product because I'm really like, I do need that thing. I would sign up for $100 a week, send me what you think I need box. Does that sort of predictive analytics, mode of consumption, mode of product discovery, anything about that alarms you?
Yeah, I think it alarms me in that, if you look through, again, we talk about the workers and we talk about the consumers, is their situation with their labor great? I have students who run some of their facilities and their turnover of their workforce is enormous. And it really is a race, constant race to meet your needs, to deliver your sugar the next day when you really didn't need it until 3 days. So it leads to this consumer model, which continues to move faster and faster and also increase their sales.
So the warehouse storage last mile delivery components of this entire ecosystem employs many millions of people. I think truck drivers alone might be single digit millions of people. What is happening in that labor market to enable all the last mile work to happen in the United States?
It's important to maybe take a step back and talk about transportation in total. So, there's global transportation, there's over-the-road truck drivers who sleep in their cabs, so it's not just a day trip. And then there is last-mile logistics, which is really what you're talking about. The delivery person, ships it to your doorstep, which has changed dramatically in the United States. If you imagine before, most people would go to the store and buy things, and now most things appear on your doorstep. And so if there's 6 million people who work in the transportation industry, and most of them are truck drivers, now you need more people because of last mile logistics. And so there's this great pressure right now on truck drivers. And the good news about it is the wages have gone up. So now, as a truck driver, you can make a good living. But there's a constant challenge right now of having enough truck drivers to meet this more and more and more. Now you have these two behemoths because first it was just Amazon, and now Walmart spent billions of dollars to improve their last mile logistics, and everybody else has to respond. And so you have this continual, what have you done for me lately, logistics, where consumers want more and more and more.
When you talk about some of the technologies that you think will disrupt the supply chain in a positive technological sense, you talked about AI, you talked about 3D printing. As a consumer, help me calibrate how serious of a change will this be?
I don't think from a consumer standpoint, it's where the big benefit or change will be. I think it's more from the worker standpoint. If the technology is in play, I think the real benefit is, how it enables, workers to be able to afford more, to be able to buy more.
We've talked about a lot of benefits of globalization and supply chain. What are some of the sort of social or cultural developments that you've watched that are concerning to you?
For example, like for me, and growing up where I grew up, the first thing I didn't want to do when I graduated from college is go into supply chain, because I saw what happened in my city, and I ended up in it. And then when I ended up in it, the light bulb went on for me that we can solve these problems through what we know through supply chain. So the problem is that for me as a corporate manager, my goal is to increase sales, to increase shareholder value, and so that's what we focus on, right? So the beauty of globalization is also the problem. We pulled all these hundreds of millions, if not billions of people out of poverty, but we created this spiky globalization. And we're benefiting the world, but then we have flyover country in the middle of the United States. We drive around cities that people don't want to go to. You have to change the education and the culture. So can we arm people in these communities to become entrepreneurs? And how do you give them the opportunity without having the capital? And so that's where I think using technology and then letting people become who they can become. But right now there's people who just, they have no opportunities.
If you were to imagine 50 years from now, looking at the global supply chain, do you think we'll still be putting things made in China into rusty boxes on diesel-burning 3-month journey, giant containers, landing in Los Angeles, making it into a Walmart? How could it be really different?
You answered the question the way you asked it, that doesn't make sense from a sustainability standpoint or even from a cost standpoint. And so what I envision is a network supply chain. I call it glocal, so it's local and global, where you would exchange ideas on designs across the planet, and you would manufacture it in a location that's as close as possible to where it's going to be consumed. If you have the production happening in the same place as the consumption, you can create an economic closed loop system that's good for the planet and good for the economy.
You've made the case that supply chain underpins essentially everything. Everything that we can touch and see, and most things that we purchase, had hundreds or thousands of people that do supply chain for a living as part of making that possible. Many entrepreneurs probably don't think of this as a sexy category. If you were to invite founders, entrepreneurs, and builders into the world of supply chain, where would you draw our attention? What are some of the areas of problem solving in supply chain that you want to see more innovation in?
Where I would draw the entrepreneurs in is you can make money through this new model that I'm talking about. At the same time, you'd be helping create the middle class again. Because if you look at the statistics of what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that the country keeps getting richer, but the middle class keeps getting smaller. So if we look at this country right now, we can see areas of opportunity. The beauty about today is we actually have technologies that will enable that to happen. It really is truly game-changing when we think of blockchain and 3D printing and some of these automation tools. And you can create this education system that feeds this system in these places. And so it's like a beautiful idea I wish more people were talking about.
So if you were made the head, the czar of supply chain, if there were such a thing, what would be some of the key policy changes or changes to the market that you would implement?
I think the key is that a healthy world economy, a healthy supply chain is where supply and demand both flourish. We can't just focus on one or the other. So it's the structure of allowing communities to become healthy, but also not in a way where it's preventing trade from the outside, because a healthy world is a world that trades together. So it's this local, global network communities of supply chain as opposed to what we're seeing today.
It's exciting to think about, because as we talk through some of the public policy approaches of harsher restrictions on trade, of creating stimulus to build manufacturing capabilities or repatriate certain manufacturing, most of those things don't last, and nearly none of them actually work. So I love your invitation into this. It's not CEOs being generous and paying non-market wages to an impoverished area. It's actually design and innovation of new ways that the supply chain works to re-invite these blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, in parts of the United States that are really rough off. There's really a role for operators, for founders to come in and design something that works in a way that the market supports it. That's a really cool way and important thing to invite people into solving that problem.
Well, you said it better than me.
There's no person better than you, Jack, to spend time learning about where this has been and where it's going. Really appreciate you being here.
Appreciate it, Evan. Thanks for having me.